weekend waffle time. So before I get into the topic for this week, what I just want to be able to say is really related to the milestone video that I did last week, and I just want to say thanks to everyone who was kind enough to comment on the video, and the response pretty much overwhelming has been just keep doing what you're doing. So I will. Thank you. Right. Okay, so seriously, the topic this week is about the value of retro games, and I suppose you could split this into new retro and old retro. So we'll start with second-hand games, and really the value is, I could start talking about cost and collectability, but I don't really want to do that. There's clearly a market for retro games, and there's, you know, collectability and cost, etc., and that's been covered elsewhere. But what I want to talk about is perhaps the value with really the amount of time you put into games. So really the question is, do you finish retro games? And I'm quite interested to see, for example, if you've invested say £10–20 on a PS2 game, then there's an PS3 game, showing my age, with a modern game, then you will expect to play it for a certain number of hours, say 15 hours, and perhaps if you play it for less you'll be disappointed, or you expect a certain richness in the experience. But for retro games, I'm curious just to see how people actually play them, because if you bought a retro game, really regardless of the monetary cost, how do you view it? Do you view it as something that you want to consume and get some value out of? Or is it something that you see on eBay, perhaps on a whim, and then say, okay, I'll just stick this on, maybe just play it once and it goes on a shelf, or maybe it's something you chip away at, really just for an arcade fix. Or maybe you do play it like a modern game, like if you bought an RPG, do you sit and use the save games and plod through it for your 15–20 hours? And I'm really just curious to see what people think of that, because the impression I get is that the retro games that are popular now are really arcade style for the most part. It's something you'll dip into and you just fancy, really just an antidote to the modern style of games that are very story driven, very heavy games, and you just want something simple and you know, fun from yesteryears. I think with myself it's perhaps somewhere in the middle. I think if there's an RPG, like Final Fantasy VI for example, or The Illusion of Time, I'll sit and put the time into it. But I think for the most part, with the retro games, I just like the idea of being able to look at the console and go, right, I want to pick one game off a shelf, and I don't care about where I am in the story, what the save game was it a difficult boss that I can't complete. It's just something I can stick on and play it for half an hour, and know that there's no saves in the game, and hopefully I'll get a little bit further than last time. Which is, I suppose, the way we all used to play games for the most part before we had save games, or, well, I suppose you had passwords, but you know what I mean. So really the question from this is, do you actually finish retro games? With, I suppose, modern games, I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard that only like a quarter of modern games actually get finished by people, but for the most part people don't finish them. But I remember with retro, well, when they were new 20 years ago, I don't think people even finished games then. So I'm just curious to see if you've got a retro game that you're playing now, do you play it to finish it, or do you just play it, as I said before, just for the arcade fix and you don't really care about it? And I suppose the other thing to briefly just touch on, going back to the start, is the value of new games versus new retro games. So for a game like Gunlord on the Dreamcast, for example, or some of these new C64 games, do you place as much value on them as you would a modern game that you've bought from the supermarket? And I think it's easy to say with second-hand games, perhaps they don't have the value because they've been previously bought, but for the retro games, clearly that they've already been sold, so maybe they don't have, well, sold 20 years ago, so they don't have the value. But for these new retro games, would you perhaps pay as much as you would for a modern Xbox or PS3 game that you've bought from the supermarket? Or is there a feeling there to say this is old so it's less valuable? Or do you say, well, this is made by a group of people who have put the time and effort in now, so they should be recompensated as much as you would for a new game? I'm not sure. I think the digital download's an interesting thing, but I think for box games, I don't know. I think if they start selling new old games, and I think we're seeing this to an extent with the Neo Geo X, the new machine, but if these games came out in the supermarket, would they sell as well as new games? If you put them side by side, would it be a case if you look at the price and go, nah, it looks old, it looks dated, I don't want to invest the money into that? I'm not sure. I've never really been in the situation myself of doing that. I think the only new game that I've actually bought is Gunlord on the Dreamcast, and I got that for about £20, and it seemed, if it was a particularly collectible Mega Drive or SNES game, that's probably what it'd be worth. So I didn't feel as if I'd been charged over the odds for it, but I'm not sure. It's a game that I've put some time and effort in, and it's like Turrican, so it holds something quite special for me, but that's not for everyone. I'm just curious to see how the value of these games is proposed. Right, I think I'll leave it there for this week, and I'm sure I've probably said a few things that will get some feedback. I try not to talk about the three things you shouldn't talk about over lunch, and one of them is talking about costs. I don't want to say, oh, not everyone has the ability to spend the same amount on games, but for me it's more about the value of how much do you get out of the game, perhaps regardless of the financial cost. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. So, thanks for watching.